So now we're going to be looking at Charles, Swedish king and the Ottoman refugee, his time in the Ottoman court, and exactly what he was up to.
In the year 1700, the Great Northern War began, and the Swedish Empire, which was at its peak, led by the young military genius Charles XII, faced off against a coalition led by the rising Russian Empire under Peter the Great. Charles won multiple victories, despite being usually significantly outnumbered, and his army, the Karelians, is regarded today as one of the most effective military forces in European history. But Charles was also a very stubborn monarch, and he thought himself to be invincible, so he began a march to take Moscow and bring an end to the Russian Empire. Thanks to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this. Although initially successful, the campaign quickly turned into a disaster after the start of winter and the lack of supplies kicked in. Peter the Great had effected a scorched earth tactic, leaving no supplies for the Karelians to harvest. A Karelian veteran named Rus describes, "The fearful cold and hardships of the winter of 1709 will never fade from the remembrance of those who experienced it. It commenced soon after New Year's. Most of our horses perished, and thousands of our soldiers dropped dead with cold and hunger. Even the very fish in the streams froze. As late as the month of May, the Baltic Sea was covered with ice full 10 miles out from the coast, and the earth was frozen until the very middle of the same month. You can scarcely imagine what a fearful condition we were in." In 1709, the Great Northern War took an unfortunate course for Sweden. Charles's foot was wounded prior to the Battle of Poltava, when he received a shot from a carbine which shattered the bone of his heel. He received medical attention from a German surgeon, who managed to save his foot from amputation, but he needed to rest to recover from his wounds and the fevers that accompanied it. The Battle of Poltava had been a disastrous defeat, and Charles ordered the remainder of his army to travel to the Ottoman Empire instead of being captured by Peter. After 5 difficult days, the Swedes reached the banks of the bog, with the Russians following close behind them. At the Ottoman border, the Turks were not willing to transport so many without the permission of the Moldovan authorities. Much time was lost before the boats were ready, with the Russians getting ever closer, and eventually 500 Swedes and their Cossack allies were taken as prisoners of war. But Charles and his entourage had finally reached Ottoman territory in Bender, a town in Moldova. Rus said about his arrival, "Charles, who until now had been victor in every battle, he who had deposed one king and had proposed to do the same with regard to the Russian Tsar, he who had made laws for the Roman Emperor, and before whom all the crowns of Europe had trembled, was brought so low that he must now receive a scanty allowance from unbelievers." The Swedes were treated with the utmost hospitality.
Yeah, Charles fell off hard. Yeah, deja vu, right? Especially with how the Russians scorched earth and the winter and defeating. It's funny how history repeats. It's like poetry, it rhymes, We've seen that before. And, yeah, that's the thing. After watching the Caroline's video and seeing just how the Russians were able to defeat the Swedish through many factors, it is just a super fascinating story, and just how, the Swedish Empire at its peak just completely collapsed. And a bit of it, yeah, Charles definitely was gifted in the, in terms of military, though I think he failed in other parts of ruling. Though it is a little unfortunate I don't think he really had a time to rule during peace. But, yeah, definitely a military man, though we do see, yeah, his fall.
And the wounded king was regarded with honor and the highest respect. The Ottomans had received him as a victorious, not vanquished king, and supplied his entourage with every comfort. The king received daily from the Sultan Ahmed III a purse containing 300 thalers. This earned him his nickname Demirbaş, which means fixed rent, and has been translated as Ironhead in Western accounts. The best dwelling available was appointed to him, but he declined this attention and encamped in the neighborhood of the fortress. A local problem was the probability that the Dniester might flood the camp during the winter, but Charles, in his usual stubbornness, refused to move the camp further away from the river. There were left about 1,800 men from the original 35,000 that had departed Saxony heading to Moscow. They remained where they were and built houses for themselves. Soon, quite a little town sprang up outside of Bender. Charles had not given up his designs upon Russia, and now urged the Sultan to raise an army and march against the Tsar.
Yeah, I think stubbornness probably is the best word to use with Charles. You know, he really, he wouldn't he really wanted to accomplish what he wanted to, and I feel like he would never deviate from that objective. Like I said, I thought that personally he should have probably made peace when he could have in positions of strength. Like when Augustus was constantly trying to make peace with him and he just refused every offer. Even Peter tried to make peace with him, but he refused again, And I think this prolonged war, which the Swedish army just couldn't fight, again, the manpower pool wasn't as strong as the rest of Europe, and the whole thing is that the Swedish empire would benefit more from short wars. I feel like Charles's stubbornness prolonged a lot of conflicts and a lot of fronts that it didn't need to, and he really created his own problem. Like, he wouldn't accept peace when he was winning, he wouldn't accept peace when he was losing. So, that was kind of like a big part of me kind of turning on him when we were watching the Great Northern War, because I was like, dude, like, I don't know, like I said, definitely gifted, though, I'm a bit mixed feelings in terms of him, but I do admire a bit of his, prowess in terms of leading armies. And the whole Ottoman thing is that the Ottomans were awfully generous towards him. Like, they treated him really well. They even, they protected him from the Russians. They even, I believe, made a way for him to go back to Sweden without having to worry about being attacked by the Russians. And Charles just refused to go home, constantly trying to rally up the Ottomans until they had to just straight up imprison him. So, again, we probably should have went home when he had the chance as quickly as possible, because even the longer he was gone with this whole Ottoman adventure, the rest of Sweden was just floundering and just getting wrecked, So, again, there are things to admire about Charles, but I think by the end of the Great Northern War, my feelings were at best mixed towards him, and I was just kind of baffled a little bit by him. But yeah.
He also wanted to establish a military alliance and a commercial agreement with the Ottomans. For this purpose, he sent Polish Count Poniatowski as an agent to Constantinople, with the order to leave no measures untried to induce Ahmed to declare war against Russia. The Count was a shrewd man, devoted to the king. Through unknown means, he influenced the mother of the Ottoman ruler, Gulnush Sultan, who was now strongly in favor of Charles and called him by no other name than that of her lion. She urged upon her son in her zeal to give ear to the king's proposal, saying, "When will you help my lion to devour this Tsar?" The ongoing Spanish War of Succession was coming to an end, which meant that the attention of the other European powers would again turn towards the east, and consequently to limiting Peter the Great's ascension. almost all the great powers proposed to help Charles. The French and Dutch offered to send a ship to the Black Sea in order to bring him home, while Austria was ready to give a free pass through Hungary and the Holy Roman Empire. But Charles refused all these offers, possibly hoping to avoid a shameful appearance in his capital after Poltava. However,
again, it's amazing just how much everyone went out their way to help, offering this guy help, you know? Being very, sort of, I guess you could say, generous. Well, then again, it's mainly out of fear of the Russians, right? But, and how much of a powerhouse they're becoming now, but, yeah.
Charles was also feared in the European courts, as he could potentially lead a 200,000-strong Ottoman army into Poland. The foreign ambassadors in Istanbul worked against Poniatowski, such as the British Sir Robert Hutton and the Dutch Count Collier. Only the French ambassador Desalures supported Charles's aggressive efforts. The British, who also disliked Swedish predominance in the Baltic Sea, decided to form a diplomatic coalition against Sweden in 1710 because of the antagonism of its monarch, trying to stop the war. During this time, Sweden was largely controlled by Heinrich von Jörsch, a believer that Sweden was the strongest country in the north and supporter of Charles's policies. He wasn't very well liked by the foreign powers either, and his government only indebted the realm and brought instability to a war-ravaged Sweden. In 1711, Elector George I of Hanover joined the war against Sweden in return for Verden Bremen. The Prussians would do the same in return for Pomerania. As soon as the king recovered from his wound, his old restless spirit returned. Before the sun rose, he was ready for action, tiring sometimes 3 horses a day and ceaselessly exercising the Karelians. Charles was supplied with plenty of money, but he spent most of it bribing the Grand Vizier Choluluali to advance his interests.
Stop letting them increase your rates.
However, the latter was also being bribed by Peter the Great, and he delayed the Ottoman invasion in accordance with his Russian ally. The Swedish colony in Bender had plenty of visitors. Curiosity led thousands from Constantinople to see the Iron Head. He was gazed at as if he had been some wild animal, and because it was his habit to abstain from wine and to attend public devotion regularly twice a day, they honored him as a devout Muslim. After a long time, the Sultan seemed to suspect the duplicity of his vizier, and not only deposed but banished him. Kepruluzade Numan Pasha, an upright, honourable man, was appointed his successor, and he tried to pay Charles to leave, but the king refused, stating that he would only return at the head of an army. This vizier was deposed just 2 months after his appointment, and the seal of the empire was given to Belteci Mehmet Pasha. He was shrewd enough to see that the king had influential friends at court, particularly the mother of the Sultan and the Crimean Khan Devlet II Gire. Meanwhile, Peter was sending ultimatums asking to hand over Charles, and as the Ottomans were already looking for war with Russia due to the conquest of Azov in 1696, they finally responded by declaring war in November of 1710. At last, the Turks actually did march against the Tsar, with an army of 200,000 men. With this enormous army, the vizier surrounded the Russians under Peter, who only numbered about 50,000 troops. Count Poniatowski, who was with the army, gave the Grand Vizier the very best advice, that he should not allow himself to be drawn into a battle, but should simply famish the Tsar and his army. But the Russians quickly surrendered, and Empress Catherine sued for peace, trying to rescue their Tsar from the siege. And surprisingly, the Grand Vizier yielded, having been bribed by Peter's wife, and a treaty was signed. The Ottoman Empire gained some territory. Poniatowski was the main opposition to this treaty, and he tried to play for time as Charles travelled from Bender to the camp. But the latter arrived too late, and the treaty was concluded.
Man, I don't remember that part in the Great Northern War series, where the Ottomans straight up declared war and all this. Seems like Charles missed out. Kind of God. Talk about a tough luck. Like, they handled that awfully quick. Man, Peter was in trouble there for a second. Wow, that's actually really interesting. I don't remember that. But yeah, once again, like Charles's luck after that decisive loss against the Russians just never recovered, did it? It's like he lost it all.
Safe passage for the Tsar and his army to return to Moscow. Charles was furious, and he accused the Grand Vizier of treason. After a heated discussion, disappointed Charles rode back to Bender. Back at Bender, the Swedish camp was flooded, and the king decided to move to Vanitsa, where he had built for himself a large stone house. Although he had never cared for splendor, he had it furnished in a most sumptuous manner, so as to command the respect of the Turks.
I love how he just moved there. He really just said, instead of going home, you know, where the rest of the war is happening, and the Swedish are still losing, he like, has this, like, like I said, I'm like, a little, like, it's a little funny to see, but he just straight up, like, almost just moves there to the Ottoman Empire, and is just living there, and they're just like, okay, I guess we'll tolerate you, you know? Like, I don't know, just something about the whole situation, it's kind of funny, like, I don't know, to me I find it a little humorous, you know?
Was also built as sturdy and defensible as possible. But Charles had become an enemy of the Grand Vizier, and now faced hostility from his Moldavian hosts. The king was threatened and told to return home, had his letters to the Sultan intercepted, and was denied the money he received from Istanbul. Even with all these hardships, the king remained firm in his resolve, and he started borrowing money from Jews, Christians, Turks and Janissaries with great interest rates, while Poniatowski gathered proof of Mehmet's treachery. When the Grand Vizier was finally deposed thanks to Poniatowski, he was replaced by Aya Yusuf Pasha, who resumed Charles's allowance of money and provisions.
Man, Poniatowski is really putting in the work. You know, for Charles there. The guy, great, so far very loyal man. He is trying his hardest for Charles right now. It's like just the situation, ultimately. Yeah, just go home, Charles. I feel like even they're like, can you go home now? You know, kind of like a guest who outlives their welcome, right? Outstays their welcome, or rather. So yeah.
3 years had passed since Charles's exile had begun, and the king hoped again for renewed war with the Russians. But with the Ottomans that wasn't going to happen, as the two empires signed a peace treaty in Adrianople in 1713. Sultan Ahmed himself wrote a letter to Charles asking him to depart back to Sweden.
Please go home.
Charles diplomatically refused, but the Turks were growing tired of the Swedes.
Yeah, Charles is so stubborn, man. A very stubborn man, you know? It's like, dude, you know, I don't know.
1,200 purses of coins were handed to the king in return for leaving, but the king refused the money. This was a little too much for Turkish patience, and the Sultan ordered that if the Swedes would not go by fair means, then Charles would be compelled by force. The Sultan stopped the supply of provisions and withdrew the honor guard that was stationed to protect the Swedes, preparing a 26,000-strong army to expel Charles from Ottoman territory. The king was inexorable in his decision to stay, so the Karolians prepared themselves for a hard struggle. In 1713, the Turks approached the wooden house at Vanitsa, shouting, "Demirbash, surrender!" The Count of Grotusan came to them trying to convince the Turks to resolve the situation peacefully. This worked, as the Janissaries respected Charles and threatened their commanders with a mutiny if 3 days of respite were not granted to the Karolians. A special Janissary bodyguard was sent to Charles to escort him to Adrianople to speak with the Sultan and negotiate. But at the same time, Charles received a letter from Poniatowski confirming that the Sultan would not accept anything other than a Swedish withdrawal. Enraged, Charles insulted the Janissaries, and the Turks readied for battle. Highly outnumbered, some Swedes surrendered, but many fought valiantly to defend their king. The king repelled the assault with his usual bravery, but it was to no avail. After the retreat to the king's barricaded apartment, a chaotic fight ensued. The king was wounded, but kept fighting along with his Carolean soldiers. After a furious fight, the Janissaries' first assault had been repelled, and they escaped through the windows. For 8 long hours, the Swedes held out against the massive Ottoman army. Charles himself came out, sword in hand, and shouting to the Turks, terrifying them with his unexpected appearance. Every attempt upon the part of the Turks to force their way in failed, and although their cannons kept firing, the house resisted. The Turks then decided to set the house on fire. Charles, instead of leaving, as they thought he would do, immediately gave orders to extinguish the flames, even assisting in putting them out.
My goodness. This is like, you know, in my head I'm thinking, this is a complete waste of time. None of this had to happen. Like, Charles, like, they're not the real enemy that you should even worry about, but like, his refusal to leave is just creating this problem that doesn't have to happen. That's the thing. And like, the dude would rather just sit there and die than, you know, just go home. And but still, even with that said, he definitely is, you see the skill of, for whatever other opinions I have towards Charles, you can just see the straight up, you know, the skill he has as a commander, and just the quality of the Caroleans, you know, or, you know, his army and their impressive, you know, resistance despite being heavily outnumbered, which the Swedes, you know, usually were. So you just definitely see that, yeah, they're very impressive.
But the house was set ablaze, and the king ordered a retreat to his apartment. The brave Swedes could not resist anymore, and in the end, Charles and the Swedes were taken captive. The prisoners were brought back to Bender, where they spent the night before being taken to Adrianople. Even at this stage, Charles continued arguing, but news from Sweden stopped that. As no word had been sent by him to Sweden since his stay at Demotica, a report was circulated that he would never return. Because of this, and his prolonged absence from his kingdom, the Swedish council deemed it advisable to offer the regency to Ulrika, the king's sister. They explained their position by claiming that they had given up all hopes of Charles's return, and that the long war had utterly impoverished the kingdom. Under these circumstances, they deemed themselves justifiable in putting the reins of government into the hands of the princess, who—
To be fair, I agree. Like, Charles wasn't coming home at all. The dude would have stayed in the Ottoman Empire forever, trying to persuade them if he could have. Like, yeah.
The name of her brother was to conclude a peace with the Tsar of Russia. When word of this reached Charles, who feared a possible deposition and didn't want to end the war, he finally made his mind to return to Sweden, setting the first day of October 1714 as the date of his departure. And on that day, the Swedes started their return home, passing through Transylvania, Hungary, and then Germany. The long stay of Charles in the Ottoman Empire was over. We always have more stories to tell, so make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the—
Alright, that was a really interesting video. It's cool to know the specifics of what he was doing there, because when we were watching the main series, I was like, dude, go home. Like, you know, but yeah, it was kind of like a giant, like, waste of time, obviously, you know, at the end. But still, a very interesting man, that Charles. So yeah.